Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if this is our cue to start. I still see a slide up. Is it our cue to start? Or does this slide need to disappear? Okay, great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to panel 1, day 1 of the eceee summer study. My name is Marlene Sahaki, and I'm at the University of Geneva. So I'm sitting here in Switzerland. And my co-host for this panel is Marta Lopez from Coimbra University or Polytechnic in Portugal. And the two of us are really delighted to welcome all of you. We wish we could be together planning to sip rosé this evening on in Hyères in the south of France. It's really a shame, but we're going to still have a great panel 1 session throughout this week. And this first panel responds very well to the initial theme that we laid out when we got together with Marta. We were thinking of energy in relation to everyday life, and we wanted to bring in this notion of upper and lower limits to energy, and of course, related to that, the notion of well-being and perhaps even energy sufficiency. So the 4 papers we have this morning, or it's already this afternoon for some of us, the 4 papers very much respond to this call, as they will focus on the question of need satisfaction and the different ways of relating energy services to need satisfaction. So Marta, unless you have anything to add, we sort of assigned ourselves different roles throughout the week. Sorry, Marta Lopez, I meant. I will be hosting today and today's session, and Marta Lopez will be on WUVA, and tomorrow we'll switch. So sometimes you'll hear more of me or more of Marta. So I don't know if Marta, you have anything to add or?
Just to say welcome all, and well, we would like very much to be at Hyères. I hope everyone would also. So welcome and enjoy.
Yes, let's enjoy, exactly. So each presenter has 15 minutes to present, and we're going to be a little strict. I don't know how, either, making a little beep or some kind of sound when you have 1 minute left. Is that fine for everyone? And so you have 15 minutes each, followed by 5 minutes for the Q&A. And some of those questions are going to be coming from the WUVA platform and fed into this forum, thanks to Marta Lopez's help. So first up, we have a paper that's going to help us travel somewhere to different places around the world. Marta Baltrujevich is going to talk to us about household final energy footprints in Nepal, Vietnam, and Zambia, composition, inequality, and links to well-being, coming out of the Lily Project, I believe, out of the University of Leeds. So Marta, the floor is yours, and we'll count 15 minutes. And you want to turn on your mic probably too.
Right, now I could unmute myself. Hello, everyone. And let's see. Can you see only the presentation, only the slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, great. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for having me. So yes, today I will talk about household final energy footprints in Nepal, Vietnam, and Zambia, their composition, inequality, and links to well-being. So first of all, what was the motivation for this research? Well, there is lack of studies that would go onto the household level analysis in Global South. So that's one of the biggest motivations for the study. And the other one is that there is this narrative that perpetuates a false understanding that improving well-being can be realized only with significant increase in energy use, or for that matter, economic growth. My research was navigated by two questions. What if energy is used for fostering well-being, what do we mean by living well? And how much energy is required to live well or to end multiple deprivations, as we will see in this presentation. And I will test 2 null hypotheses. First is that with increase in income, energy footprint increases too. And second, households with basic well-being outcomes use more energy than households without these outcomes. So before I dive in, I will present very shortly data and methods. So to calculate household energy footprints, I needed 3 types of data. First of all, nationally representative household surveys, which I obtained from Nepal, Vietnam, and Zambia. And they have expenditures as well as various socioeconomic information, like information about health, education, income, characteristics of dwellings, and much more. Secondly, I needed energy energy data, which I got from International Energy Agency. And that was my basis for the extension for the final energy use. And the reference year was 2011. And finally, I needed to know the production and consumption structure of national economies and their international trade patterns. For this, I used GTAP, Multi-Regional Input-Output Database. And as a result, I could calculate the energy intensities and calculate energy footprints. So in my analysis, I calculated Gini coefficients to account for inequalities, and I used logistic regression to examine socioeconomic characteristics and their effects on chances for household collective well-being outcomes. But before I dive in, I would like to talk a little bit about the definitions and conceptualizations that I use in the analysis, because not everyone is familiar with footprints. So when I talk about footprints, I mean direct and indirect energy use. That's usually how we talk about any like carbon footprints or energy footprints. Direct refers to residential fuels and vehicle fuels. So this is all energy households use directly for cooking, heating, or operating their vehicles. And residential, I split between modern fuels, which is electricity and gas, transitional fuels, which are still polluting, but a little bit better than traditional fuels. And that's mostly kerosene use and diesel use at home. And traditional fuels, which are biomass fuels like firewood, charcoal, or dung. Indirect energy refers to energy embedded in products and services that households purchase. So this can be anything from food, going out to restaurants, buying clothes. All of these things have embedded energy, and we account for it while calculating household energy footprints. And the most, I think, important here, what I mean by well-being. So in my research, I use a eudaimonic understanding of well-being based on theory of human needs by Doyle and Gove. And this is in opposition to a hedonic understanding. We are not talking about life satisfaction. So how I understand it, the baseline, so we can agree that everyone has certain baseline, and this baseline has many components that we can call universal characteristic of need satisfaction. So every human need has need for certain universal needs, like having adequate food or having access to clean and safe drinking water, having protected shelter, so we are shielded from external environment, having access to healthcare, being able to have security in childhood or economic security. So there are myriad of universal characteristics for what every human needs. And all of these characteristics are, as I said, yes, universal, and how we satisfy them depends, that's a little bit different story. So how we satisfy them depends on culture, depends on time and space and place. And so we can imagine that, for example, food, we can satisfy need for food by eating red meat or eating a vegetarian diet. That's like a classical example. So there's a myriad ways of how we can satisfy our needs, and they also depend on provisioning systems. And what I mean by provisioning systems here is it can be physical, like infrastructure or technology, depending on if we have access to public transport or just cars to drive to work, for example. You know, that depends from what physical provisioning systems we have, or social, depending on culture, markets, or norms that we are embedded in. We will satisfy our needs differently. And all of those characteristics of these satisfiers and the way we satisfy them enables us to achieve basic needs required for our well-being. And here I mean autonomy to participate in society, having cognitive understanding so we can participate, and having mental and physical health. This is all good, but how we operationalize operationalize it, it's different, a little bit story, because depending on the available data, we can it can be a little bit tricky. So we can talk about outcomes, for example, and here we can use, for example, healthy life expectancy or malnutrition status, which would tell us about if certain basic needs are satisfied or not. And with the intermediate need satisfiers, as I said, we can have different types of food that we eat, which depends on culture. We can use different variables that we talk about, how we get to work, for example. So this is different ways of how we can satisfy our needs. And for our analysis, we chose data based in all 3 countries. So I had to choose the variables that would be available in Vietnam, Nepal, and Zambia. And that would talk a little bit about the outcomes or characterize the well-being, basic well-being outcomes of the household. And I chose modern cooking fuels. So if a household had more than 50% of modern cooking fuels, education, at least 9 years, sufficient food. So if household said, yes, we have enough food, our children are not malnutrition, and access to clean and safe water within 1 kilometer from a house. And just to give a context, how many households have kind of outcomes. In Nepal, all 4 outcomes have only 5% of population, in Vietnam 30%, and in Zambia 6%. And before I jump to the results about household and their well-being, I want to give the overall context of these countries so we can see what kind of energy footprint overall they have. So here is, I present the final energy footprint per capita, and we can see that Vietnam sticks out as the highest, with highest energy footprint per capita, followed by Nepal and Zambia. At the same time, they are way, way below half of global average. And so these are really low footprints. And the biggest category contributing to the footprint in each country are coming from direct energy, which here is depicted by green color of housing and then blue in transport. And indirect is really small. So there is not much that households spend on like miscellaneous or restaurants and on hotels or recreation. So I want to dive into the housing category since it's the biggest and it's the most important in the analysis. So here I split the footprint by, first of all, I show by residential fuels, and I split the footprint by an income decile. So 1 corresponds to the 10% of the poorest population, and 10 income decile corresponds to the richest 10%. And we can see, first of all, if we focus on the red arrows, we can see that the red arrows indicate the overall upward or downward trend of energy use with increased incomes. And Vietnam has clear downward path with increased income energy. We can see that energy use significantly drops. The interesting case is Zambia, where we see that the footprints are actually increasing with income. And this is what happens where the accessibility and, most importantly, reliability of modern fuels is not available to households. So no matter how much richer you are, if you don't have access to reliable electricity, you will still use alternative fuels like charcoal or firewood. And the figure also indicates energy stacking. So within poorer households, it is a partial switch or accumulation of energy options. And this means that with affordability again and availability, households are adopting modern fuels. However, richer households still have quite a big proportion of traditional fuel use, which might be used in times of crisis or, for example, for food that requires longer cooking. And that leads us to inequalities. So here I present 3 different figures for each country. These are Lawrence scores for different footprint categories, as well as income and expenditures. If you look on the black solid line going through the middle of each figure, this represents hypothetical perfect equality, meaning everyone in the population has exactly the same amount of energy, income, or expenditures. Farther away from the black line, more inequality. Closer to the line, more equality. So what I want to say with this figure is that the modern fuels are the most unequally distributed in all of the countries, especially in Zambia, where there's almost no one in the population has actually access to modern fuels, and those are way more unequal than income or expenditures or indirect energy footprints. So with that, I will go on to the next one. So what are energy footprints for households with well-being outcomes? And I will just repeat, I meant modern fuels, access to modern fuels, education, safe water, and a sufficient amount of food. So here I split the energy footprints. And again, I present for the total energy footprints, so indirect and indirect, all categories. And I split the households by income quartiles. So, so the lowest is 25th quartile, then mean, and 75th quartile. And I compared them with the national average in each country. And we found that households that do have access to clean fuel, safe water, basic education, and adequate food can use as little as half the national average in their country. This is important as it goes directly against the argument that more resources and energy will be needed for people in the global south to escape extreme poverty. The biggest factor is the switch from traditional cooking fuels like firewood or charcoal to more efficient and less polluting electricity and gas. And as we have seen on previous slides, energy resources are extremely unfairly distributed, and this results in poorer households using more energy. And the last result I want to show is the results from logistic regression. So here I try to answer a question: what is the recipe for successful households? Are households that have, for example, higher income or access to devices, are they more likely to have those four well-being outcomes? Results are presented by odds ratios. So I calculated logistic regression where 1 indicates no effect, positive effects are greater than 1, and negative effects are between 0 and 1. And the kind of main message to take from it is that household having protection, meaning solid shelter, indoor sanitation, minimum floor space area, have high odds ratio of having their well-being outcomes achieved. When we consider characteristics linked to individual consumption, like income, car ownership, or indirect energy footprint, we do not see much of an effect on increased odds of having of household having their well-being achieved. So this is really important because it shows that provisioning systems, access to provisioning system, can deliver need-satisfying energy services more efficiently. So what? That's
Marta,
my last.
thank you so much. We have just 1 minute left to wrap up.
That's my last slide.
Okay.
So what? Are we arguing against global south using more energy for development? Well, no. Instead of focusing on how much energy is used, we are pointing to the importance of collective services like electricity, indoor sanitation, or public transport for alleviating poverty. And in addressing these issues, we cannot shy away from asking why so many countries in global south have such a low capacity to invest in those services. And I believe it has to do with the fact that poverty does not happen. It is created via tools like structural adjustment or high cost of servicing national debts. And in the situation where climate change is caused by a rich minority in the global north, but the consequences are borne by the majority in the poor global south, human development is not only a matter of economic justice, but also climate justice. Thank you. Sorry for extending.
No, great. Thank you so much, Marta. That was a really interesting presentation. And what a nice way to start the panel on consumption and demonstrating how it's not about consumption dynamics. It's about systems of provision. So I'm going to open the floor now to questions, and people who are visiting us. We have some 30 people that are with us here today, and others who are following over Wova. So please do feel free to put your questions right here into the chat. Or into the Wova Q&A. And while we're waiting and to get people started, you know, there's a saying in French, it's always hard to get the first pickle out of the jar. All the other pickles will come after. So I can start. Marta, this question about addressing inequalities, I follow you. I appreciate the point. But should it not be rather to focus on, I'm sorry, you said alleviating poverty should be a focus. And I was wondering whether it shouldn't be addressing inequalities at the same time, because you could have a situation where the systems of provision change and more renewable forms of energy are made available. But if you don't address structural inequalities in those countries, it will be the rich that end up benefiting from better forms of energy. I don't know if you've thought of that or addressed that.
Yeah, I mean, it was too little time to present all of it, but yeah, you're totally right. And our colleague Kate Bailey had her study done in Zambia on this issue, and it was about also electricity access, where Zambia is actually a really good example of those kind of inequalities, because all of the provisioning systems are just for people that are rich or live in the mining cities. So, and at the same time, people that do not have access to electricity and try to, for example, steal it or try to gain access in maybe not always legal ways, the punishment is really, really harsh, much harsher than one would expect that it should be. So it's definitely yeah, the problem is not only to consider the external inequalities between global north and south, but as well within the countries, and who has access to those provisioning if they're accessible. And as it is, yeah, the case is now is that in these countries, especially in Zambia, the access have only privileged rich.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Just any more questions for this one? For this talk? So hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for more of a discussion. So I'll now move on to the next presenter. So we have Noel Cass, who is going to build on this theme of relating needs to energy usage through a talk called Social and Material Cogs of the Needs Satisfier Escalator. Noah, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. The floor is yours, and I'll stop you at just 1 minute to 15, sorry.
Okay, 15 minutes. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah.
Perfectly.
Great. Okay, can I have the first slide, please? Okay, so the research for this paper was funded by the Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions, a research centre with staff from 21 universities. With different themes that you can see on this slide. The focus was high-end or excess energy consumption, both in the household and through travel. And in the paper, I narrowed this down to focus on flights, so it's the very high end of energy consuming behaviour. And the very nature of this research, just to put it up front, meant that we would be explicitly normative, because even the description of excess energy consumption could be seen as a normative judgment. And next slide. So to set the context for our focus on the high end or excess consumption, it's important to note that there are very large inequalities in how energy use, carbon emissions, and particularly high impact activities such as flying are distributed across the population. I'm looking at the UK here. So the quotes here on the left are from our team's work, and they highlight how car mileage and flights are disproportionately distributed by income. And the graph just shows the percentage of people taking at least one flight a year by different income deciles. A very clear relationship. Next slide. And this graph actually comes from other work at the University of Leeds, Anna Owens and John Barrett. And it shows household energy footprints by income deciles, or 5%. and they're broken into end energy services, with the greens representing air travel and other mobility, accounting for a large proportion of the difference between the carbon footprints of different income groups. And the red lines on this slide we put together for an information video, and they indicate the current average UK household's lifestyle footprint, that's the top line, and then the average levels required to meet 2030 and 2050 Paris Agreement targets in the UK. So the exact figures differ from different sources and different analyses, but the general picture is a requirement for 80 to 93% reductions for household energy footprints in developed countries like the UK. And the obvious target, some would say, many would say, is the emissions of those who consume the most. So our interview study sought to identify and then interview these high consumers to discover the content of and the reasoning for their high consuming lifestyles. Next slide. However, our project was explicitly entitled Excess, and so in the context of this session, and with feedback from Marlene, and of course, there are the policy-facing proposals such as donut economics and Di Giulio and Fuchs' concept of sustainable consumption corridors. So this idea of minimum and maximum levels of consumption, the paper wanted to go through and outline some of our thinking about the issue of defining excess energy consumption and targeting it through policy. So we came up with roughly 4 quantitative and 3 qualitative possibilities, which are outlined in this table. Can't go into a lot of detail. The 3 quantitative definitions all arose from us working with aggregated travel diary data on annual car mileage. First, to identify the characteristics of individuals in the top 1, 5, 10, and 20% most car mobile, and thereby defining them as excess travellers. And we identified extreme outliers using box and whisker plotting. So these were kind of artifacts of how we did the analysis. And a small number of individuals that the outliers analysis would identify, targeting them would not give significant reductions. So the use of cutoffs can be linked to rationing, and we modelled that in the UK, rations of 20,000 car miles per year would reduce mean car mileage over that by 9%, whereas rations of 15,000 or 11,000 miles would similarly reduce mileages driven by 15% or 24% respectively. So the problem with all of these definitions is that they can simply be challenged as being arbitrary and just setting numbers and doing an analysis based on it. So the qualitative definitions offer a bit more kind of explanation and reasoning. So the idea of excess as everything above minimum needs then requires defining what minimum needs are, and Marta's presentation was very good at explaining some of that. It's usually done through a consensual process, for example, in the work which defined minimum income standards as a measure of how much various types of households need to earn to reach what members of the public in that society think is a minimum acceptable standard of living. But these consensus definitions are also a prime example of the problem of ratcheting norms and expectations because they're relative to the society in which needs are satisfied, in particular needs satisfiers exist. Now, the next definition relies on distinguishing needs from wants or desires. We heard about that, and I think we'll probably hear about it again from Yafin. Basic needs cause harm when they're not satisfied compared to excess consumption, where the decline in consumption might result in subjective discomfort or loss of convenience or social status. It does not result in increased physical or mental harm, or in the decrease of a person's ability to participate meaningfully in their society. So this approach leads to prioritizing avoiding harm, and Giulio Mattioli suggests that this leads to a limit on needs satisfaction at a level generalizable over the relevant population. And in the case of climate change, that could mean the whole global population. So that sets a very strict and low level of upper needs satisfaction. And finally, defining excess by reasonableness and justifiability is an approach that we have now used in our deliberative workshops, which I'm not reporting on here. It can be seen to suffer from an element of subjectivity. And as we found in our interviews, everyone portrayed their own levels of consumption as reasonable or at least justifiable. Next slide. So the theories we drew on in designing the research were drawn from the most inclusive and interdisciplinary theoretical frameworks on energy consumption, because we're a multidisciplinary team. We'll here draw on 3 main frameworks. So Brand Correa and colleagues' 2020 paper on audited needs satisfiers and the needs satisfier escalator draws on the distinction, which Marta has already explained, between needs and satisfiers. So I'm not going to go over that definition again, but their model of an escalator or an escalation mechanism reflects how these different orders of needs satisfiers lock together and lock in particular ways of satisfying those universal human needs in particularly energy demanding ways. Next slide. And their orders of satisfiers are depicted as cogs because they're conceptually interlinked. And the higher orders, socio-technical systems of provision and activities, are more determining of the lower orders, such as the energy services aimed at and the specific devices through which they're achieved. So thus, as these quotes indicate, individual choices of which energy services and devices or appliances are used to satisfy needs as highly structured by the higher orders of satisfiers. Next slide. Another approach arises from philosophical thinking about intention and habit, seeing as behavior or practices are intentional or habitual. And this writing points out that energy consuming behaviors such as driving a car are habitual at lower levels, such as steering and changing gear, but that intentionality rests on the purposes for the driving, such as getting to work, which in turn rests on another intention to provide shelter and sustenance under capitalism. So Daramy Williams and colleagues thus see household decisions as being structured hierarchically in three categories: lifestyle choices at the top, mobility choices, and activity and travel choices on a daily basis. New slide. So in summary, all of the frameworks I've just described share certain aspects. They accept that human action is diverse and different theoretical approaches are required for explaining or predicting it. No single totalizing theory or analytical approach can simultaneously grasp all energy consuming activity. They're multi-scalar or nested, so they identify certain influences and drivers being more relevant to explanation of different scales, from the individual up to the societal or international. They suggest the best way to describe or understand this is that activity at each scale is framed or conditioned by what's going on at the next scale up. And they include a dynamic or biographical aspect in which choices like purchases, home purchase, vehicle purchase, and life events structurate subsequent decisions and routines, which collectively form the energy consuming behavior and practices on the whole of society. So next slide. And I'm sorry, it's a lot of theory. I'm just going to bring in one more person, Giulio Mattioli, one of the co-authors with Grand Korea. And he specifically seeks to understand the factors behind massive increases in long distance travel. So as Gillian was saying, we need to focus on these long distance trips. He critiques models of sequential lock-in as being too simplistic and looks instead at processes of habituation, acquisition of dispositions and socialization. So these processes include upbringings where parents have daily long distance commutes or overnight work trips, migrant families, normalization of international travel and institutionalization of it, and the concept of mobility links. And by this he means skills and dispositions acquired through experience and practice, which ease further travel, social networks stretched over ever greater distances, and specific practices such as international business, specific sports such as skiing, which can be passed on intergenerationally, and the internationalization of rituals such as weddings, anniversaries, stag and hen parties. Next slide. So the part of our project I want to present the data from is from the interview study, and the details of the sampling strategy are given here. We had to find proxy indicators for household and travel consumption, and we then used area-based analysis of England to select lower super output areas with these characteristics at a high level in aggregate. We got some purchase telephone data, and we used professional recruiters to try and find out these people and fit them to a rough demographic quota. So next slide. We haven't got time to go through the sample, but you can see that they're largely kind of middle-aged. They have more than half of them had 2 cars, but many of them have more. And they had, in particular, a large annual number of return flights. That's the green section there, people with 5 or more return flights. Okay, next slide. To move on to findings, in terms of the household emissions, the interviews confirmed largely what's known and expected about the drivers of energy consumption in the household, including income, employment type, large houses, multiplicity of vehicles, appliances, devices, and infrastructures in those homes. So I also learned about some unique things called American-style fridges, that was new to me, and vinidors or wine coolers, which people consider to be normal things to have in the house, but certainly not from my point of view. Next slide. To turn to flights, although our recruitment process has only required a subsample of 5 participants who flew a certain number of return flights a year, a third of the sample flew at least 10 times return flights per year. So these quotes highlight the importance of business travel in habituating international flights. but there was also more discussion about the resulting holidays. So people might visit places through work and then go back for their holidays. Next slide. Lots of text here. I suggest you focus on the quotes because they're quite fun. These holidays were driven by a variety of motivations for seeking out peak experiences, for rewarding oneself and one's family for hard work, seeking variety and novelty. International flights were normalized in these people's lives as an identifiable, social practice with which they were familiar and comfortable. Next slide, please. And social networks were mentioned by Mattioli as clearly influential in several ways. Friends and family share and duplicate routinized trips. They serve as destinations to visit, especially in the case of people with international families. They provide destinations such as villas and apartments abroad, and they're often tied into these increasingly internationalized versions of network maintenance rituals such as weddings, anniversaries, and the stag parties I mentioned before. Also birthdays and funerals and all sorts. Next slide. Social norms and influences, including having friends who could actually facilitate flights at a moment's notice. That's the top right quote. The importance of the media, particularly in making different destinations attractive. There was this ratcheting search for novelty and change. There was a Bourdieusian distinction. So people went to places in order to avoid normal tourists at the normal places. And there was also a desire for freedom being encouraged in and pushed onto younger family members. Next slide, please. So we also looked at material influences, the material cogs of the escalator. They may seem more prosaic, but they're also in the data. No one owned an airplane, unsurprisingly, but proximity to an airport was spontaneously mentioned by many of the interviewees unprompted when they described where they lived. Access to accommodation abroad was widespread, and it was seen as a target and aim for investing in one's future. And it set up routines of visits multiple times a year. And there's also the specific space-time of a 3-hour flight seen as the perfect aeromobile spatiality. And this was directly compared to the cost and inconvenience of holidaying in the UK by car. So flying abroad was seen as a lot easier than driving somewhere in the UK. Next slide, please. Next slide.
You have just 1 minute left, I guess. It's
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not far away. I'm discussing the three aspects. So the frameworks, we did find this habituation, familiarity, and it was based on the factors which Mattioli identified. We saw specific aspects of mobility links confirmed, such as skiing being handed on father to son. The systems of provision kind of over-determined the expectations, so particularly really cheap flights, lack of taxation of aviation fuel, flights became easily locked in. And media and the novelty ratchet were particularly driving this escalation. Next slide, please. In terms of needs and well-being, we saw that travel was satisfying needs, but they're not really basic needs. Sociality, belonging, and family life are basic needs. They're being satisfied in particularly high carbon ways. COVID lockdowns in much of the data showed that people did actually appreciate positively the way that their travel, international travel and business travel were reduced. So it might have been a useful experience for these high flights. Next slide. And then in terms of access, we cannot say that our analysis gave any definitive support for one definition of excess energy consumption. There was a general acceptance that their own travel was above what is needed. So in the abstract, I think the best definition we found is to combine this Giulio Mattioli's idea of need satisfaction limits with a kind of strict Brundtland definition of sustainability, and an almost Kantian requirement for generalizability. So what is generalizable over the entire global population without damage? And the answer is not very much. So this, we should also focus as well on eliminating inequalities, because that's what's required for everyone to share an equal level of travel and need satisfaction. And we should also, of course, be reflective about our own academic practice. So personally, I'm perfectly all right sitting in Lancaster rather than coming to the south of France to talk to you. Okay, thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Noel, and thanks for the reminder that we also have to put our research lens on ourselves and be reflexive. Are there any questions yet from the chat? I know questions tend to come up also later on WUVA. Let me see. I read your paper, of course, and there's this one anecdote that I really love of people going to visit a glacier. You had the quote up there, this idea that you want to visit the glacier before they disappear, but you don't realize that you're contributing to the demise of that glacier. So this sort of the lack of coherence somehow. Maybe I have a question for you based on the presentation we just heard from Marta. Does it make sense to come to a universal agreement on what needs are to then be able to say what might be excessive? Could that be one approach, or is that something you would shy away from, a more universal definition of what an upper limit to travel might be in relation to needs?
I think the idea of universal needs is very important, but it covers more basic needs, the definition of basic needs rather than the upper level. So as I said, one definition of excessive travel could simply be anything above satisfying those basic human needs. The trouble is that in policy terms, that's not a very popular definition.
That's right. It's not, we wouldn't get into enough detail there to be able to give, yeah, everything would then maybe be excessive. There's a question here from Rehab Khalid. Are there any policies in place against excess consumption, such as tourism-based air travel, other than soft nudge campaigns? Do we know of any policies or restrictions on excessive consumption?
I think, well, the only one I can think of off the top of my head is in France, the policy to try and remove the shorter haul flights. So as far as I understand, that's going to be applied such that if you can satisfy your travel needs within France and possibly within some of the neighbouring countries, if you can do that by train or high-speed travel, that those shorter flights should not be taken. I'm not exactly sure the details of how that's going to be implemented, but it does seem to be an approach which is saying, you know, there is a limit to what you should be allowed to fly.
Yeah,
But it still doesn't address the longer haul flights, which are much smaller in number, but have a disproportionately large impact on the planet.
right.
So I don't know of any other imposition type top-down policies on longer distance travel.
Yeah, I'm not sure of any. I know policies within universities that are emerging. And another follow-up question from Rehab is, are such policies even possible when they help the economy grow? I guess, yeah, the eternal question of growth.
It's a very strange one. So we just did our deliberative workshops, as I said, where I actually went back to some of these interviewees, and we were proposing the ideas of things like strict rationing or tradable rations of carbon or air miles. We're trying to work out how to do this, but our high consuming individuals, our interviewees, many of them were very opposed to this and said that the rations that people get for their travel and their flights should be based on how economically productive their lives are. So they were suggesting that we take away rations from older people, from retired people, from young people who haven't got a job yet, and from the unemployed, and we should be giving them to people who fly around the world doing business. So that totally was the complete opposite of our kind of understanding of what a strict rationing system would be. So yeah, the cognitive tie between productivity and growth and travel is still very much there. In kind of
very interesting, very interesting. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's some normative dimension that we still need to challenge. Thank you, Noel. We'll go on to the next presentation now. So we have José Luis Ramírez Mendiola, who is going to talk to us about from capabilities to capacity, examining core power capacity requirements in the UK residential sector under the capabilities framework this time. The floor is yours, José Luis.
Thank you. Just checking that and you can see the screen.
We can see the screen. I think you just have to put presenter mode and you have 15 minutes.
Great, thank you.
We've lost it now.
Yeah, sorry, I was just selecting the presentation view. Can you see it now?
Perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. The work I'll be presenting today have the aim of conceptualizing what we refer to as core power capacity requirements, as well as to provide some estimates of what this might look like based on the analysis of empirical power demand data. But before we jump into that, it would be good to provide a bit more context about what the problem we're trying to address is, or what we think the problem is. Anyway, so in general, peaks in energy demand tend to be quite costly, both in economic and environmental terms. But given current social and institutional conventions, some peaks are kind of inevitable. But not all are necessary, and not everything that happens during these critical peak periods is necessary. And a more cost-reflective tariff mechanism would help in addressing these issues and discouraging excessive consumption, particularly during those critical periods. And in order to do that, we first need to determine what is it that we consider as excessive, and what different types of consumers should be entitled to. But one size does not fit all. And if everyone had the same or very similar requirements, we would see, statistically speaking, much less diversity, and the distribution of energy requirements would look very much like the typical bell curve, like this one here. But is that really the case? Turns out that the distribution of energy requirements in the UK residential sector is much more complex than this typical normal distribution. And in a previous study of this diversity of the residential annual energy requirements in the UK, it was found that the overall distribution was roughly made up of 3 main clusters. And while more or less homogeneous range of energy requirements would entail a sort of linear relationship between increases in demand for energy and things like the size of the household, meaning that the more people, the more energy is required. A more detailed breakdown of the different compositions of the clusters reveals that this is far from being the case. So when it comes to defining what is an acceptable level of demand for energy and what isn't, we need to make sure that the more disadvantaged groups are not being charged more than they need to, and effectively subsidizing those who are better off. So essentially, we need to make sure to identify the range of sizes that allow everyone to have access to the same capabilities. So enter the capabilities framework. So the capabilities framework is based in 3 key concepts: the functionings, which are those different ways of doing things, and nowadays, most of which require some kind of energy or energy service. There's also the capabilities, which are like the entire set of functionings people are able to achieve, and the conversion factors, which are the varying abilities of different groups of people to transform material resources and commodities into well-being, which depend on a number of things, but some of them are linked to their personal circumstances, and some of them are linked to their environment. But anyway, how does this relate to energy consumption? Well, here's where the concept of core capacity comes into play. So in a nutshell, the core, or rather like the set of cores, core levels of power capacity provision are what enable the set of basic capabilities. However, in order to adapt this capabilities framework to the context of energy research and study of energy demand, we need to unpack this connection a bit further. So in the context of this capabilities framework, energy is part of the set of material prerequisites, or the means to the realization of certain capabilities, which are the ends. That's what people are trying to achieve. And in that sense, core capacity can be understood as the level of energy service provision that allows for that, for an adequate access to those basic energy systems services, which in turn enable the attainment of secondary capabilities such as food preparation, and which are preamble to the attainment of basic capabilities such as maintaining good health. But again, the connection between capabilities and functionings is not a straight line. And those functionings or different ways of doing things can fall into the sufficiency space, or they can fall into the excessive consumption range, when, for instance, someone is keeping the indoor home temperature at 25 degrees during winter so that they can dance around in their underwear or things like that. So it is precisely this sufficiency range that we are interested in. And with that in mind, we looked at what appears to be sufficient for most people over most days, over a number of years, based on empirical data, empirical demand data for over 20,000 households that were monitored as part of different studies, in order to provide preliminary estimates of what the set of cores of power capacity provision might look like. So the overall average of the largest sample of households would appear to indicate that the upper threshold of this range of core capacity is somewhere between 2 and 3 kilowatts. However, more detailed breakdown shows that there is considerable variability across the sample when this is calculated, for instance, based on income, or based on whether they are located in urban or rural settings. And the analysis of the data from the second largest study shows a fairly similar picture, although in this case it would appear to be a more clear, it would appear to be clearer that there is a positive correlation between the level of affluence and the upper threshold of the set of cores of power capacity provision. And similarly, there appears to be an increase in power requirements associated with rural settings, which are mostly relying on some form of electric heating to maintain adequate levels of thermal comfort. So in conclusion, the results of this preliminary analysis highlight the following. So the first being that diversity matters, and the upper thresholds of the core capacity requirements associated with different sectors of the residential consumer population range from about 2 kilowatts to about 7 kilowatts for those who rely on electricity to provide heat for their homes. And the fact that a positive correlation between affluence levels and core capacity requirements was observed would appear to indicate that the differences in conversion factors between these groups have non-negligible influence, and these might need to be studied in more detail so as to assess their effect more carefully. But because of the same reason, we can say that top-down studies based on national average or figures at a very aggregate level are just not enough, and a more nuanced view of what is required to achieve the same or similar levels of well-being across different sectors of the population are needed in order to determine what constitutes excessive consumption. The differences across the different datasets provide clear evidence that the fact that there are no black and white solutions, and that the boundaries between what is and isn't essential are and will likely remain a bit fuzzy, but I think that's okay. And finally, it is clear that there's still much more to be done when it comes to fully unpacking the relation between energy consumption and well-being. But hopefully in the future, we will be able to carry out much more detailed studies of the different energy service people have access to and measure more precisely how much energy is required in order to enable more specific capabilities. And that's all from now. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, José Luis. So we have time for questions. I see that Noel put up a comment. I don't know, Noel, if you want to voice it, since you're one of our speakers, you do have the possibility of speaking up if you want to share that comment.
I was actually just answering a question which went to the panelists. So it was a point from Rehab about per capita. So it was a comment on my presentation I was answering.
Okay, sorry about that. All right. So, well, José Luis, you've raised sort of the methodological issue of trying to quantify and qualify this link between capabilities. Do you have any suggestions on how top-down studies might be complemented through other kinds of efforts or approaches?
Well, I think it's when it comes to this kind of analysis, it's always important to address the diversity of the thing you're trying to analyze, which in this case might be what seems to be enough for different groups of people. So the more detailed your analysis can be, the better. So that will require, as I was mentioning, more targeted studies that look specifically at the effects of such diversity into what you see on the aggregate.
So these would be like studies in households, like qualitative interviews or workshops or those kinds of methods?
Yeah, I think it would have to be some sort of combination of many different things, because you need to have people's views on what they're doing, what is it that they're doing, and why is it that they're doing, and why is it that they have a reason to value the kind of things that they're doing, so that then you can link that to the amount of energy that they are using for those different end uses.
Yes, yeah. And actually, Riyam Khalid has a related question. So if you go beyond national level statistics, do you have any ideas about what level or categories of populations should be distinctly targeted for well-being and excess consumption? For example, are there differences between urban rural contexts, or should it be income-based? How would you distinguish different types of energy users?
Well, to be honest, I don't think I have an answer to the question of what exactly is the best or the ideal way of segmenting the population, because normally what we do is based on the information that we have. So in a way, we're sort of limited by the data that we have. And normally the kind of sort of reference points that we have are these kind of things like income and whether they live on urban and rural locations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best way to do it. But for us to be able to explore that a bit further, we need, again, much more information about the groups of people that we're trying to study. You do seem to find some correlations between those things, but that again might just be a bit of a consequence of the kind of things people in different locations have access to. So access to gas might not be that well spread in rural settings, but access to electricity is much more common. So then it is reasonable to expect that they are going to rely on this particular type of energy to power most of their needs. The opposite might be the case on a different location where access to electricity is restricted, but you have access to gas. So then you might try and look for all the different ways in which you can use that fuel for powering your energy needs.
Yeah, thank you. So it goes back to Marta's presentation on the systems of provision and how energy supply relates to consumption.
Yeah.
Great. Any more questions from Uva or from the participants? No more questions, so we'll move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much, José Luis.
Thank you.
Now we have Yefim Vogel, who is going to be presenting socioeconomic conditions for satisfying human needs at low energy use, an international analysis of provisioning factors. The floor is yours, Yefim, and you have 15 minutes.
Great, many thanks, Malene. Let me try and share my screen. Right, can you see this?
That's perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay, then I'll start. Okay, so the starting point for this presentation is, that low energy use and human need satisfaction are currently mutually exclusive. What does that mean? Well, even with aggressive decarbonization of energy systems, global energy use has to be reduced if we're going to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees without relying on currently speculative negative emission technologies that's now acknowledged by the International Energy Agency and the IPCC. And that implies that there's such a thing as a maximum sustainable level of energy use. There's been suggested 27 gigajoules per capita of final energy use for 2050. And on the other hand, energy is obviously required for any kind of provisioning, so any production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, which means that human need satisfaction obviously requires some level of energy use. And the question is then, how much are these two things in conflict? And indeed, in the current political economic provisioning regime internationally, they are very much, because either, all countries with sufficient need satisfaction display highly unsustainable levels of energy use, and all countries with sustainable levels of energy use remain within insufficient levels of need satisfaction. So we can depict that roughly as shown here on the right, where the relationship between energy use and need satisfaction follows roughly this kind of saturation curve, where need satisfaction increases with energy use and then plateaus. But the problem is that no country achieves sufficient need satisfaction within levels of energy use that are sustainable. So, and that also implies that if countries that currently don't meet needs were to achieve sufficient need satisfaction, they would exceed the sustainable level of energy use. And if a country that is currently unsustainable in their energy use was to become sustainable, they would fall below the sufficiency threshold of need satisfaction. So it's a dilemma, really. So basically, currently sufficient climate mitigation in terms of sustainable levels of energy use and sufficient human need satisfaction are mutually exclusive. And the point of the paper here is to try and reconcile that. Okay, the starting point for this is then that while no country meets needs within sustainable levels of energy use, there's quite a bit of variability. There's countries that achieve similar need satisfaction outcomes at very different levels of energy use, or similar or very different need satisfaction outcomes at the same level of energy use. So the question is then, what are the factors that determine these differences, in particular the socioeconomic ones? So our first research question is, how does the relationship between energy use and need satisfaction vary with socioeconomic moderating factors, or what we call provisioning factors? And our hypothesis is that this relationship, the orange one that I showed you before, between energy use and need satisfaction, depends on those provisioning factors and can be shifted towards higher need satisfaction outcomes by beneficial provisioning factor configurations, so that the relationship would enable meeting higher levels or achieving higher need satisfaction outcomes at lower energy requirements, basically. And conversely, that there's such a thing as differential provisioning factor configurations where the relationship would be shifted towards lower need satisfaction outcomes and higher energy requirements. And the second question is then, well, if countries achieve beneficial provisioning factor configurations, to what extent does that enable them to achieve sufficient need satisfaction within sustainable levels of energy use? So does that really cut it? Okay, the framework that we use to analyze this basically depicts the relationship between total final energy use as a core part of biophysical resource use and human needs satisfaction as moderated by these provisioning factors. And we look at different ones depicting basically state provision, political economy aspects, and physical infrastructure and geography ones. And in terms of human needs satisfaction, I should say by provisioning factors, we mean basically measurable characteristics of provisioning or provisioning systems. And in terms of human needs satisfaction, we use the theory of human need by Lynn Doyle and Ian Guff, which Marta already presented. And the variables that we're looking at are sufficient nourishment, water access, sanitation access, basic education, minimum income, and life expectancy in the needs realm. We have a total of 19 indicators and data for a total of 106 countries, covering most of global energy use and global population and GDP. And it's a cross-sectional analysis for 2012 with data from a bunch of different international energy databases like IEA, World Bank, and so forth. For the methods, the main analysis is what's called a regression-based moderation analysis, where we try to analyze the moderating effect of single provisioning factors. So basically, as the framework showed, energy use, the relationship between energy use and need satisfaction as moderated by these provisioning factors. And the way we do that is through regression, where need satisfaction is predicted not only by energy use, but also by the provisioning factor and their interaction term. And that, on that basis of that regression, we then also do some simple modeling where we model need satisfaction outcomes for particular values of provisioning factors. So for example, for high levels of provisioning factor, and see how that changes or how that would likely change the outcomes. Okay, what does that look like? So the basic relationship just between energy use and in this case life expectancy, I've shown you as a stylized version. This is sort of like the empirical version of that, but I'll look at that on a logarithmic energy axis, logarithmic x-axis. And now what we're interested in is like, how does this relationship now vary with a provisioning factor, in this case the quality of public services? And what that looks like is roughly like this. So what we see here is, so the colorful curves here show the relationship for different levels of public service quality. So the orange one is median levels, and the yellow one is high levels of public service quality. The blue ones is low levels of public service quality. And what that implies is that that higher levels of public service quality enable or are associated with higher need satisfaction, higher life expectancy outcomes in this case at the same level of energy use, and that a particular life expectancy target, let's say 65 years, could be reached at much lower levels of energy use with if the quality of public services is high, then they could be at median or low quality of public services. So this is the type of result we see with this analysis. I'm just going to quickly go through two other needs indicators, in this case, sufficient nourishment and safe sanitation access. In both cases, we see that public service quality has similarly beneficial effects, where it shifts the relationship basically towards higher need satisfaction outcomes and lower energy requirements of sufficient need satisfaction. And this is now this was kind of one provisioning factor, and we've done this analysis for 12 provisioning factors. I'm going to show you just 6 of them and show you sort of their overall effects across these different need satisfaction indicators. So we've got here public service quality, income inequality, democratic quality, and electricity access, all shown in green. And all of those are what we call beneficial provisioning factors. So all of these have consistently beneficial effects, which means that higher levels of these factors are associated with higher levels of need satisfaction and lower energy requirements. And then there's two factors, extractivism and economic growth, that are the converse of that are what we call detrimental provisioning factors, where higher levels of these factors are associated with lower levels of need satisfaction and with higher energy requirements of high needs outcomes. Just to remind you, this is what that looks like in terms of the relationship. So basically the green, the factors shown here with green results shift the curves towards this green curve here, and the red ones towards this red curve here. The final step that we do is that we look at how different provisioning factors act together. So a joint analysis of, in this case, 3 provisioning factors on need satisfaction, which is a simple multiple regression of energy use alongside these 3 provisioning factors on need satisfaction. And similarly as before, we then model outcomes for particular configurations or setups of these provisioning factors. And what we do with that is that we look at 3 different scenarios, basically. One is what we call the good provisioning configuration, where we use three variables. We look at high levels of public service quality plus low levels of income inequality plus lower levels of extractivism. That's what we call a good provisioning configuration, and compare that with a median configuration where all of these variables are at their median levels, and compared with the status quo provisioning configuration where they're all just where we use the empirical data for each country. And what we get is something like this. So this is now showing drinking water access as one need satisfaction variable against total final energy use. And we can see that the distribution for the status quo provisioning roughly follows the saturation pattern that I've shown before. And that at median and in particular at good provisioning configurations, the relationship between energy use and need satisfaction, in this case drinking water access, is much less dependent on energy use, high need satisfaction outcomes are much less dependent on energy use. So there's much less of a slope here, and indeed high levels of drinking water access could already be reached at fairly low levels of energy use. So this is exactly the kind of relationship that we would like to see. And this holds across the 6 need satisfaction indicators that we've looked at. So this is all, in each case, the green curve is this kind of good provisioning scenario. And in each case, the relationship is shifted towards much better outcomes, where sufficient levels of need satisfaction, which is above this kind of dotted green curve here, could be reached based on this analysis within the sustainable level of energy use, which is this vertical curve here. However, that doesn't mean that that's what's currently happening. That means that that's what could happen if countries pursued this kind of provisioning. But even countries that do currently have relatively favorable provisioning configurations, so configurations that would allow them to achieve sufficient need satisfaction at relatively low levels of energy use, don't necessarily display low levels of energy use. They tend to display relatively high levels of energy use. That means that there's other things at play other than need satisfaction, obviously, that drive energy use, and which also means that there will be other interventions required to reduce energy use. So that itself calls for energy sufficiency as an intervention. But to kind of interpret these findings and conclude, empirically, it appears that in the current international provisioning regime, in the current political economic regime, economies are unsuitable for providing sufficient need satisfaction within low and sustainable levels of energy use. However, if countries with beneficial provisioning configurations are much more likely to reach high levels of need satisfaction at low energy use, and that again, is this would be this green curve, for example, that suggests that if countries were to improve their provisioning configurations, that would enable countries where, or that might enable countries where needs are currently not met, say countries in the global south, maybe, might enable them to reach sufficient need satisfaction within or without mobilizing these high levels of energy use that we currently see in need satisfying countries. And conversely, it might enable countries where needs are currently met but that are highly unsustainable in their energy use to slash their energy use and hence also their emissions without falling below sufficient levels of need satisfaction. So that could potentially reconcile need satisfaction and climate mitigation. And there's a few policies that map onto this analysis, onto the kind of beneficial and detrimental factors that we've identified. One is to improve public services and provide them for free at the point of use. So that would support calls for universal basic services. It would also appear beneficial to reduce income inequality. So that could, for example, call for minimum and maximum income thresholds or highly progressive taxation, also things like universal basic income. Strengthening democracy. So one way of doing that might be, for example, to have citizens' assemblies with implementational powers. Providing universal access to electricity and clean fuels. Martin has talked about this, and this will be particularly important in countries in the global south. But also to abandon extractivism and current practices around that, and to abandon the pursuit of economic growth, at least beyond moderate levels of affluence. Beyond moderate levels of affluence, that's where they become detrimental, basically. And so overall, if we look at the kind of changes that would be required to enable sufficient need satisfaction within sustainable levels of energy use, some of these run quite contrary to the dominant political economic regime, which is very much focused on the pursuit of economic growth, which is where we see increasing inequalities and often impairing public services, and where consumption just tends to expand, and so does energy use. So ultimately, I would say that if we are going to reconcile climate mitigation with human well-being, we might need a broader transformation of the economic system of the sort of political economic paradigm as such, towards one that prioritizes sufficiency and prioritize providing sufficiency in terms of need with as little as possible energy use. And that could mean something like degrowth for the global north and something like post-development for the global south. And I would be keen to discuss this or anything else in the discussion.
Yeah, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Marta made a comment that some of these policy recommendations are aligned with the SDGs, but we know there's also a pro-growth SDG in there. Are there any other questions from the Q&A, or maybe I can ask a quick one and then we can move into the general discussion in the last 10 minutes. Yefim, I noticed that both for you and for Marta, when you operationalize the Doyle and Goff approach, it's mostly about basic health. What about the other two needs? The idea, I think it's, what is it, participation and autonomy? Are those the other two? Is that much more difficult to capture? Because I think that's when it starts getting interesting. How do people understand their participation in society?
Yeah, so I haven't just used health. I've used nourishment and drinking water and sanitation, so forth, which you could see, however, as preconditions of health.
Yes.
But also basic education. So that's probably more in the realm of enabling social participation. Anything else that is like that, what Ingolf calls autonomy of agency, is harder to operationalize, or harder to get data for. We can come up with ways of thinking about, like, hey, what constitutes opportunities to participate in society, but is that measured internationally? And the question is usually no, sadly. So that also, that points to, like, if we, and I think that reflects actually that because like a lot of this, the data that is available is from organizations such as the World Bank, which have obviously a particular understanding of development, which doesn't seem to be working for what we're trying to do here. So the indicators that are available are reflective of the development paradigm, which seems to be a problem in itself.
Yeah, and that brings us to a very nice question from Noam Bergman here. Economic growth is negatively correlated with provision of need satisfaction, and actually positively correlated, we could add, with negative environmental impacts. So what conclusions can we draw from that in terms of green growth, or I think it was an automatic correct, or degrowth?
Well, that's exactly what I've kind of tried to hint at the end. Is I think that supports calls to abandon growth, at least in affluent or already moderately affluent countries, and in affluent countries, I think that will necessitate strategies of degrowth. Just that already the massive reductions in energy use that we need are very likely to come with to at least slow down the economy, and so we'll need to find ways of slowing down the economy without people falling into hardship and people depriving people of basic needs, and that's exactly what the degrowth movement calls for, to basically make the economy independent of economic growth, but also to stop pursuing economic growth. So it's not just kind of like to be able to buffer recessions or something like that, but to be able to to overcome growth dependencies, really. And I think this analysis supports these claims and supports claims that is necessary. But I would add that it also so degrowth doesn't typically speak to the global south. It sort of says that's what we need in the global north, and we need to kind of stop exporting that model of development or like imposing that model of development on the world, on the global south. But I think this analysis also shows that pursuing economic growth as the route to human development, as the route to kind of well-being, isn't necessarily a good idea, isn't necessarily efficient, and isn't necessarily, and at some point turns detrimental as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Yefim. So in the last 8 minutes that we have, because we've been asked to really end on time, I'm going to just think of one general discussion topic. There's so many we could choose, but there seems to be a bit of a tension here between one approach, which might be, let's just agree on what those high consuming categories are and focus on those. Let's go for SUVs, let's go for flight travel, etc. And another idea, which might be actually, it's not those individual consumption categories that are significant, it's the systems of provision, it's the political space in which certain forms of consumption are enabled over others. Do you all want to quickly maybe have a quick comment on that general question? Is it the rich, or should we be thinking of how our societies could be reorganized? And maybe just one thing I find really positive about all of your presentations is that we're having discussions now that are not just about environmental problems. We're talking about societal well-being. And I think that's another way of approaching this issue of climate change that is more salutogenic and hopefully, more positive, let's say, although the outcomes are still not positive. Any comments? A last round of comments from everyone, I would say, maybe starting with Marta.
Yeah, I'm thinking about your question, and I think it has to be both at the same time. We have to address, provisioning systems, how we provide for satisfying needs, and the over consumers, and these maybe also talk about should we allow certain overconsumption, or certain high energy intensity services and goods, using SUVs. So I think they should be both addressed at the same time from both kind of directions. And with the I think I will finish here. I had something else, but
we can come back to it. What about Noel? Do you want to comment?
Yeah, of course, it's definitely the rich There you go.
We don't hear
To
you
get
very
into-
well.
I said, yes, of course, it's definitely the rich. But I'll expand on that. Yeah, I particularly like the graph I presented that showed the red lines, the limits on household consumption against income low deciles. And almost everyone, even the highest earners, kind of fit their home energy and their heating and lighting all fit within the Paris Agreement limits on household energy use. So all of that household baseline of energy use needs to come down, but the differences between different groups across society, it is generally the other things. It's the mobility, particularly air travel, and then also consumption of goods, and then leisure. These are the areas where we see huge discrepancies that go way beyond those consumption limits. So I think that in itself justifies targeting particular kinds of consumption, and that is leisure, disposable income, the way that disposable income is spent by the people who have the most disposable income, essentially. And at the bottom end, you know, people have talked about universal basic income, universal public services. All of these are very good and necessary policies to make sure nobody falls below a certain limit of energy consumption for basic needs satisfaction. But then that level of energy consumption for basic needs satisfaction needs to come down slowly. And that will be largely through technology and energy efficiency, traditionally understood.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. José Luis?
Hi, yeah. Well, I think it's kind of going back to what you mentioned at the beginning. So I think it's a lot about making sure that fairness is sort of embedded into their like systems of provision, and make sure that everyone have like really everyone really has access to the same level of opportunities, and at the same time discouraging those excessive consumptions from those who tend to have more resources available to them.
Yeah, I really like this. I mean, we talk a lot about sufficiency, and there's always a lot of interest on the lower limits of consumption, but I really like this increasing interest in excessive consumption. It really places attention to those upper limits. Yefim, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say both is needed, both in terms of like the timescales of change. You know, if you think of climate mitigation, we need to tackle high emissions right now, and that's something that could happen immediately. And I think we need sort of a more, you know, systemic change to actually get an economy that can operate within planetary boundaries and provide well-being within planetary boundaries. And I think maybe just one thing that is important to kind of be aware is that like tackling overconsumption does not necessarily mean like nudging high consumers, or like sort of doesn't mean like individually driven change, but you know, tackling overconsumption can be a political thing. It must be, I think, a political thing, as demand is political and is an outcome of the systems of provision. So that's kind of, you know, that's kind of linked to the lenses that we've been applying here. So and I think in terms of like how change happens as well, the two go really hand in hand, is to build momentum around justice and inequalities, as well as environmental issues, you know, linked with social and the environmental.
Yeah, but it also goes back to this very sort of tactical approach that Noel was describing earlier in his focus groups. When you're talking to these groups, okay, let's say we don't want to go with an individual approach, but there seems to be a lot of work that still needs to be done to get people to be thinking about justice and sustainability in those terms. There seems to be this normative understanding of change as being individual, as sustainability being based on a merit system that's tied to economic productivity. I mean, these are things that clearly we need to also challenge at a broader scale. I'm looking here at the chat to see if there are any questions we need to pick up. All of this seems very close to what Kate Raworth is doing with her donut economy. I guess everyone would agree that that paradigm. Does anyone want to comment on that specifically? But her idea of social foundations and biophysical limits is something that I guess nod your head if you agree, if it's relevant to this panel, yes. And let's see, what else do we have here? That Noel, you want to maybe say something about, it's not about discouraging excess.
Yeah, I mean, it's more or less the point that was just made. It's
Yes.
not about nudging. Yefim said the same.
Yes.
You know, the people who need constraining are people who only believe in nudging and personal behavior change, and it's not going to happen through that.
Yeah, I think another thing we can draw from this panel is you've used capabilities, you've used needs. You're looking at these theoretical approaches in different ways, and we see that it is quite complex. But the good news is you're also demonstrating how this can be done, both through qualitative and quantitative methods of matching needs or capabilities to energy services. And I think that's also very promising. So in terms of methodological advances. We're getting at the very end of time here, so we need to wrap up. I just want to thank everyone for being here at the first panel of panel 1 on day 1, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. We have 2 sessions tomorrow morning, the first one starting at 10:30 until noon CET time, and then 12:30 to 2 p.m. So everyone keep going and asking your questions on WOVA. We can, that will be open, and people, different presenters can continue to respond through that platform. And if not, we'll see all of you on Zoom tomorrow. And I just want to maybe do a round of applause for our presenters here. Thank you so much. A little round of applause. Thank you for your presentations, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
you, Maria.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.